one area that I wanted to touch on, it's funnily enough probably even more controversial than what we've just been talking about. There's another quote in the book, which is, "Parents matter, but they
Mm.
don't make a difference."
I was thinking when you were
Let's
going to get
talk
around
through
to
this.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
That,
Well, there's so
that's
many other interesting topics.
that's gotten more attention, those 4 pages or whatever they are, 7 pages maybe, than the rest of the book in the popular press. So much so that I actually got a contract from Penguin to write a book on that topic, because I do think parenting,
Yeah,
is really where a lot of this stuff has its impact, genetics. And so I did start to write it, but then my great editor made it clear to me that the level you have to write for a parenting book is not a level I can write at. I
yeah,
mean, you really got to get down with the diapers and all of that. And, Blueprint, I thought, was about as far as I could go. And a lot of people do find it a difficult book. I mean, it's not your airplane page turner sort of book. But
yeah.
so I decided I couldn't do it. Now, if you
That's a shame.
understand,
I'd love to read that book.
yeah, well, I heard someone else was doing it, and then that also helped me decide not to do it. But then turns out the book they wrote was no good anyway. So I don't know. Anyway, at my age, I want to do things I like to do, and I came to realize I love doing Blueprint because it's kind of a summary of 50 years of research that I've done and other people in the field. But parenting book, I didn't get that vibe. It was a struggle for 6 months, and then I eventually had to give back a very large advance, which isn't something that's fun to do. You know, in advance for the book.
Yeah,
Yeah, so a lot to say about that, but if people understand the title that you just said, "Parents Matter, but they don't make a difference." And so that's sort of
yeah,
the issue of means and variances. So the don't make a difference. That means don't make kids different. That is, the nurture
yeah,
thing really doesn't have much of an effect empirically. What matters is genetics, and parents provide the genetics, but also parents matter in the nomothetic sense that we're talking about. That our species can't develop by itself. It's neotenous, and it needs a caregiver. So parents definitely matter. Whether you're there to support the child or not, but how much support you provide doesn't make a difference. You need some evolutionarily expected average level of care. But beyond that, it doesn't make much of a difference. And that's important for parents to realize, that their kid isn't this fragile thing that bugs me. These parenting books and media, they really take advantage of parents who are anxious about things, to give them that idea that, if you one false step and your kid's screwed up for life. Well, kids aren't. They're very resilient. And I think, evolution was good on that score. It's very dangerous that we're so slow to develop. We need caregivers. Parents matter. Caregivers matter. Our species don't develop by themselves. But it's evolutionarily good enough environments. Sandra Scar used to call it good enough parenting. It doesn't have to be perfect parenting. It has to be, provide the basics that kids need, and that includes love and support. So parents matter. I definitely don't want to say they don't matter, but they don't make a difference nearly as much as we thought. And so it's a double whammy for parents, because first of all, they often don't recognize until later how much effect their genetics has on the kid.
yeah,
So that's the nature side. But then they assume that, well, they provide the nurture, but they don't really. The way the environment works is this non-shared environment. So they don't have much control over that. And so in a way, put these together, and it says parents need to relax a bit more. They don't have nearly as much control as they think they have. Now, that doesn't mean you throw your hands up and say, oh, well, can't do anything. Just let the little bugger develop the way he develops, It's not that at all. It's that a parent is not it's not a factory producing good little citizens. It's a relationship. And like with your spouse, if you have a relationship, and I said, well, she's pretty good, but I can shape her up, I can make her into a more interesting, intelligent person or whatever. I mean, that's a disaster, right? But that's what we do with our
yeah,
kids. And what we should be doing is love them and support them, and um, not think that we are going to shape them to be what we want them or think that they should be. And so I think the
Yeah.
message here is that parents need to love their children and support them and do things for them because you love them, not because you want them to be what you want them to be. And part of that is finding out what they like to do so that you go with the flow more. Just, I agree with what you said before. Doesn't mean they can't do something that they're not particularly good at, but why not find out what they're good at? And it's a virtuous cycle. They'll do it more and they'll like it more and they'll get better and better at it. But it's because you found out what they like to do rather than assuming that they will, that you can mold them to be what you want them to be. So, and
Yeah.
the other side of it is you don't have as much control as you think anyway. So you might as well face that and just love them and enjoy them. And I think stand back and watch them become who they are, and that's an
Interesting.
important message because, when you have more than one kid, you see how different they are. And that's an amazing part of parenting is to see them become who they are rather than thinking you're going
Yeah.
to make them into what you want them to be. And it's what you do with other relationships. And this is the longest relationship you'll have in life with your kid. So, you know, I think a lot of
There's
these parenting books really are are dangerous in telling parents you must do this, you must do that. And then it's
yeah.
counterproductive to enjoying the relationship. I mean, so many young parents who spend their life trying not to get pregnant, and then it's so hard to get pregnant later in life when they want to. And it's just, it seems like such a waste to see them anxious all the time about everything. And instead they should relax and enjoy it is more than they do.
Yeah. Yeah, no, there's nothing that you said there that I disagree with. The thing that immediately popped into my head when I read that is, everyone's been on an airplane and they see parents there with their screaming child. And in
Mm.
that moment, me having never had children, not have hoping to have children in a couple of years, but not at the moment, is my judgmental self where I'm saying if those parents would just discipline that child properly, that child is going to grow up to be, going to have tantrums, going to have mood issues, going to be entitled. They're just kicking and screaming, and the parent doesn't do anything about it. Right? Those are
Hmm.
the issues that always irritate me, and I always go
Absolutely.
through my mind, and I think that's the parent's fault. They need to be properly telling that child that's not a correct way to behave.
Yep.
I want to be
And
clear, and I don't want to misrepresent what you mean. Do you
yeah.
think that the parent intervening in that moment or not over a number of years will have practically no impact on how that child grows up and who they become to be?
Well, first I'd say that I'm not saying parents shouldn't do anything. You shouldn't. I mean, if you shouldn't let a kid be a brat like that and be out of control because it's not good for them. So, part of
Yeah,
loving them is saying you can't do it. It doesn't mean, it doesn't mean you don't, it's completely hands off. You don't, if your kid, your one child is hitting the other child over the head, you don't just say, oh, well, I can't do anything about that. You can change behavior, but you're not going to make a difference in personality. So you can stop your kid from being, annoying everybody or, crying, shouting or, being outrageous. But that's because you're trying to control that behavior in that situation. And it's your job as a parent to do that. And you can also do it because you love them. You know it's not good for them either. Because it's not going to be good for their relationships with people if they can't control themselves emotionally. But don't think that you're making a difference for psychopathology, personality, or cognitive ability. You don't make a difference in these psychological traits, but you certainly can control behavior. A good example is in England 10 years ago. So there's a big push against bullying in schools. And you can definitely control the bullying. Kids get reported for bullying and people take it seriously and they sit the kids down and talk about it. And you can really reduce bullying. But are you reducing bullies? Once you're outside that control of the school, out, in the streets later, I think the bullies are still bullies. And maybe you've learned to deal with it better, not being bullied or whatever. But so you can control the behaviors, but you don't want to assume that you're then getting rid of bullying in life. I mean, it's got to be better that at
Yeah.
least you control it in one situation. But, there's still bullies out there, as we see on the internet. My God, that brings out all the bullies in the world, doesn't it? So I
Yeah.
think just to emphasize the point you make, which is a really good one, when that kid's screaming on an airplane, you should look at those parents and say, come on, get it together. Your child shouldn't be doing that. You should recognize that some parents have a harder time. Some kids are just emotionally more labile or whatever. So it's going to be
Of
harder for
course.
some parents than others, but they certainly should just be letting Johnny run up and down the aisles screaming and all of that. That's something that there's no excuse for. I mean, if a child's freaked out and crying, there's only so much you can do, but you want to see the parents doing that. You don't want to you see parents saying, "Oh, that's Johnny, just that's the way he is." So
Yeah.
I think it is a very important point that you make there.
So do you think do you think that if the parents do control that behavior, say from age 0 all the way up to 4 or 5, say at every single incident that parent stops the child from acting inappropriately, compared to another scenario where they don't and the child is just let run rampant, they're screaming, they're taking control of everything, the parents really do not influence that situation at all. Do you think that kid, by the time they reach 18, is any different in those two scenarios, in their personality, in their psychopathology, across any of those dimensions?
I don't think in their intrinsic sort of personality and psychopathology, perhaps in their control. So it's just like me and my father. My father, has this quick temper and um, gets angry, really easily, and it stays angry for a while. So I've learned that that's just not good for me, and so I control that. But I still, if I had allow myself, I still could get easily angered at things. I've controlled myself so much that I don't often get to that point. I recognize the signs before and I deal with it. So I don't think I've changed my emotional lability fundamentally. I've learned how to deal with it. Isn't it the same as like with obesity? I still have the genetic propensity for putting on weight. If it wasn't for Ozempic, I would be back, those 11 kilos would be right back. Well, right within a few months. So I've controlled my um, weight, but I haven't changed my genetic propensity. And probably the best
Yeah.
example is alcoholism. There's a fairly strong genetic component for alcoholism. But if you don't drink alcohol, you're not going to be alcoholic. And I know several kids of alcoholic parents who won't touch alcohol just because that you can't become alcoholic unless you drink a lot of alcohol over a long period of time. And they don't want to go
Yeah.
there because they saw how awful it is. So they haven't changed their genetic propensity, right? But they've changed their behavior. And, that's good enough, I think. So, yeah, it's a good general point you're making. And I haven't really talked about that at that more general level, but it is a good point that you change the behavior, but that doesn't mean you're changing the genetic propensity.
Yeah. It's challenging because the reason I think about it is, I think about parenting a lot. I think it's a fascination with neuroscience and development. I mean, what could be more interesting in raising a child? And there's one trait that I want to be very sure that my children don't have. It's the number one thing that irritates me more than anything is entitlement. And
Yeah,
it's the only thing that I would actually be I would be, and I always talk about it with my girlfriend, that it would be so upsetting to us if our children grew up entitled. We want them to be grateful people. Do you think parents, because especially with something like entitlement, it seems like that's, in my intuition is that's nurture, right? That's how they're taught to deal with gratitude of things and to be entitled with their material possessions, or to be happy that they have them, and that seems to be nurture based. Do you think that we have control over a trait like entitlement? If you, I don't know if you'd consider that a
yeah.
trait, but entitlement as how you define it, like, can parents control that?
Well, that's such a complex topic, entitlement, because it's sort of attitudinal. And if you grew up in a very wealthy family, you expect servants to just have your clothes out, and you don't think about these things. And so you would say, if this person then went out in the real world, they'd be acting in an entitled way. But really, they're just acting on the basis of their world as they experienced it. But what you're talking about is lack of gratitude or whatever. So maybe a simpler topic to start with is kindness. I always felt that's the most important thing for my kids. And it's not unrelated to what you're talking about, but I think being
Hmm.
kind is really important. And a kid
Of
who's
course.
aggressive, antisocial, going to find it harder to be kind. They're not like naturally kind, right? But they still can learn to be kind. It's the same sort of thing we were talking about. That if it's very important for me as a parent and I see my aggressive kid being aggressive, I say, well, no, that's not cool. You really have to be kind. You have to be nice to people. And if you need to be selfish about it, you can say what goes around comes around and it's probably better for you too. But it's just an important value for me. So as your parent, I do want you not to do those things and to do these things. So you definitely can make a difference, but I don't think I'd be taking my aggressive child and making them less aggressive. Again, it would just be, they would learn to deal with it. They'd say, yeah, I have this aggressive tendency, and that's not cool. It's better to be nice to people. And so you could get them, I think, to do that. So you're changing their behavior, but I don't think you're changing their natural tendencies. And so entitlement, though, is a higher abstract level sort of thing. I know what you mean, and it bugs me too. It's why I don't take graduate students from Oxbridge, Cambridge, and Oxford, because a lot of them silver spoon in
Yeah.
their and they have the sense of
Yeah.
entitlement. And I want kids. I want kids. I want graduate students who have been out in the world, and the best ones are ones where they've done stuff in business, they've made money, and then they say that isn't what life's about, just making money. They want to do something more meaningful. So that's the
Yeah.
type of student I really like. Sort of the
Yeah. Of
opposite.
course.
They want an opportunity to work really hard rather than people to
Yeah.
give it to them on a silver platter.
Yeah, exactly. And when you see people like that, I always love to attribute it to the parents. I love to give them the credit for that because it seems like that's what they deserve. I worked, as I said, I was a tennis coach. I'm a tennis coach for many years, and I worked with a lot of kids. And the best kids are the ones that are not entitled. They're really grateful, and they're just having a really good time with the content. And then, maybe it's my own bias and my own sort of my own bias, and this is making me like portray that onto the parents. But whenever I met those really grateful kids, I'd see the parents and they're really grateful and they're like really doing a good job. And then the entitled ones are always, at least in my mind, again through my own bias and my own lens, were the ones that were wearing the designer handbags and giving them a much less emotional attachment and much less emotional safety. And to me, those things make a difference, or at least it seems to me that those things make a big difference on how they turn out and how they develop.
Mm.
I don't know. Again, I am biased, and all of those things
Yeah.
are my own views.
Well, I think you might. I think these Oxbridge kids, for example, are entitled because not some attitude that was instilled in them as much as just that was their life. I mean, things come to them on silver platters. And you'd say,
Yeah,
well, it's time to wake up, see the real world and everything. But I less attribute that I'm less negative about them than you are, because I think
yeah,
it's not that their parents instilled that in them. It's just their experience. And in a way that makes them very
yeah.
confident, that sort of thing. So I'm not as negative about that. But the other part you're saying about um, gratitude, I would just say they're kind, they're nice people, basically, and that involves a you
Yeah.
know aggregation of things. And definitely, there's nicer people than others. And one of my early personality studies was trying to show that kindness was not as heritable as other traits, because I thought that it was what the
Not as
parents.
heritable.
Now, that I did a study actually asking psychologists, what traits do you think will not show any heritability? This is before it
Okay.
was known that the first law of behavioral genetics is everything heritable. And they came up with things, and pretty high on the list is kindness. It feels like that's something. It's sort of your entitlement thing that you think parents instill that in their kids, and I really thought that too.
Yeah.
And probably because it's so important to me with my kids, I want them to be kind. So we did
Exactly.
we
Yeah.
did a twin study though. Kindness is just as heritable as everything else.
And what's that number?
About 40% is here. Personality
Hmm.
is a little
And
less
40.
heritable than, say, cognitive abilities. I mean, not a little, 40% versus 60%. But, and there's some
Yeah.
personality traits that are maybe as low as 20%, some as high as 50 or 60. But on average, it's about 40% of the variance is heritable. That means 60% is not heritable. But then again, that non-inherited environmental component is not nurture. It's this non-shared
Yeah.
environment that is not what the parents instill in their kids. So I know it's a lot to take on board, but this is like representing the field. I mean, this isn't like my peculiar idiosyncratic take on these things. There's just lots of evidence
Yeah.
that's described in Blueprint to a large extent.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I really think you need to write the parenting book. To be honest,
Well,
that's all I'm getting from this is that needs to be written because there'd be so much content in that I'd love to get into.
If you enjoyed that short podcast clip, then I'm so confident you will enjoy even more the full conversation. You can click it here. Click it. Come on. You know you want to. Click it. Click it.